This is Michael Hansen, and welcome to my video here. I know it's been a while since I've made my last video. I've received a lot of comments on my channel. Most of them are okay good, some of them are stupid, to say at least, and some of them are what I would call, in some extent, meaningless. But nevertheless, one of the reasons I make this video now, after a while now, is that some things have happened. Things have changed since my last video. When I made my last video, I was still a master student at the University of Copenhagen. That is no longer the case. I have graduated from my master study, my master program, and I can now call myself formally a physicist, a master of science in physics. So that's pretty nice. It's also pretty strange because as of now I have nowhere I need to be. I have a family that I just have to take care of. I have my 2 children and my wife. But other than that, I just don't know what to do right now. Because what I used to do, go to lectures, do assignments, and of course write on my master thesis, and not at least prepare for the defense of my master thesis. I don't have to do that anymore right now. But then again, I have some more time to make videos here on YouTube. Yeah. I'd like to address some of the comments that I've gotten. One of the first comments that I got was that somehow me being an undergraduate at that time was inappropriate for me to address some of the issue in Brian Mullen's videos, given that well, he was a graduate. Now, I don't know exactly where in the US you sort of set a cut from where you are a graduate student and when you are not a graduate student. But as far as I can tell, you're a graduate student when you start on your master program or your PhD program. So in that sense, I was actually a graduate at that time. But that's not the point, actually. The real point is, well, you can also say, for one thing, that I know in the US it's actually more custom that you stop your formal education with your bachelor. You can work as an engineer, as far as I know, with a bachelor degree. Whereas here in Denmark, it's actually more the custom that you complete your master program before you go out to do work on private companies or public or whatever it should be. One thing is though that you can also have I think we call it a diploma engineering graduation, which essentially is the bachelor degree. I haven't looked that much into the difference in order to see what's the difference. When you have the master's degree in engineering, you are called civil engineer. I'm not sure what the actual difference is, I must admit. I haven't looked that much into it. Yeah, one other thing that you might have noticed right now is that I have a terrible cold, so not only, as some of you have mentioned a couple of times, I have a funny accent. I totally own that. I would put the dust on my shoulder and clap myself on the back and say that as far as pronunciation goes and accent goes, I would argue that I am not the most terrible person I've heard here in Denmark to pronounce English words. You could for fun and funny things look up our former Prime Minister, our former Prime Minister, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, and take a look at when he speaks English. One funny thing is that I was on a vacation in Sweden. Where else? And we met a couple of Americans, and they actually said that they thought that we had a nice pronunciation. Not Danes in whole, but me and my wife's pronunciation of English. I think they called it very American. I think it's because, no offense, Americans tend to have a more flat pronunciation of English, whereas British English is more singing. It's more high pitched. If you want the far-fetched version of it, it's Miss Hyacinth's version of English, but nevertheless. So I think there we might have some common ground there. Yeah. So what else have happened? Well, some of the comments that I would like to sort of address, and I'm sitting down and it's very comfortable and cozy, is please stop writing me about the Holy Bible. You know, I've tried to read it, and I think I've gotten. I'm talking about the Old Testament here, the Book of Moses and so on. I read some of it, but I really just got, sorry to say, bored about it. I think I read most of the New Testament, the one with Jesus and so on, and I find that easier to read, so to speak. One thing though is that I would like to say that, stop making comments about it. It's not annoying. It's not that I really care. The problem is that I don't care. I don't want to hear you say that if I accept Jesus into my heart I will be saved, or whatever kind of bullshit, sorry to say, you bring to me. I don't care about it. I don't need salvation by Jesus or anybody else fictional character. And that's how I see about it. For me, at most, Jesus was a carpenter that lived roughly 2,000 years ago, and that's it. Now, what is written in the Bible, what is written in the New Testament, if you take away all the magical things, then I think there's some important considerations to be made regarding how to live your life and so on. But I will also make that remark that those considerations you can find in many other written pieces by philosophers and so on, all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. Yeah, that's actually one thing I would like to investigate at some point. I've noticed that for some reason Americans, probably also British people, tend to call the old Greeks very different names, and also the Romans, than we do here in Denmark. In Denmark we would call him Platon with an N at the end. We would call him Aristoteles or Aristoteles, and also, for example, let's see, Mark Anthony, where we would call him Marcus Antonius. Now the thing is that I would like to know what is actually more correct. And me, as being an European, I would like to think that my pronunciation, of course, is the most correct, but nevertheless. Anyways, I'm just curious why you have changed the name so drastically. Pronouncing pronouncing the names a little different, this is okay, but removing letters, Aristotle where is the LES at the end? But the point was that you can find many of those considerations on how to live your life and how to be a good person, be a just person, and so on. Especially just person is Plato's in his Republic, I think it's called. How to be a just person. To be a good person, you can also find the idea that you should be good to others, that you should treat other people like you would like to be treated yourself. You can find that in the German philosopher Kant, for example. I'm not sure what Kant. No, that's not correct. Kant, Immanuel Kant, for that matter, and so on. So I think that you can write. Sorry, you can read the Bible, and you can certainly get a lot of information from it. But I would also argue that you need to be careful what you do with that information, because some parts of it is most likely rubbish. I would argue that no person here in the world, nowhere, has just hopped out from a boat and then walked around on the sea. I would also argue that no person ever has just put down his staff and then divided a sea or a lake. And I will also argue that no person here on earth never has and never will be able to just turn water into wine. So like I said, if you take the Bible and the New Testament and you remove all of those magical things and you remove all of those things that we know for sure is not correct about the universe, how people were created, how humans were created, and so on, I think there's a lot of good information there. You can get something from reading those texts and use that. You can argue with it. You can use it in a discussion about how you should live your life as a good person. But nevertheless, please stop telling me to take Jesus into my heart and I will be saved and all that kind of BS. I don't want to hear it, because it's crap in my ears, to be honest. I am and will probably always be what you call an atheistic agnostic. So if you want me to if you want an explanation for that, the atheist part means that I don't believe in a God. I really don't. And I don't see the reason why I should believe in a God. The agnostic part is about knowing. So you could say that although I don't believe in a God, I can't just discount him. I can't just say that he doesn't exist. So I don't believe in the existence of God, but I don't know whether he exists or not. And I think that's sort of a fundamental part in the natural sciences, in physics, for example, is that although some physicists believe in a God, I had a very good, very nice professor, a lecturer at the university who believed in God and was a Christian, believing Christian, and I didn't see him as a lunatic or anything like that. It's not like that. But I think there's a tendency among some scientists to say that God just doesn't exist. But I think the most scientific notion, conclusion, would be to say that we simply don't know. And furthermore, the question itself is not scientific because we can't devise any experiments to test it. We can't even formalize or formulate an hypothesis to explain what God might be and how to test experimentally how to sort of find his existence. So in that sense, that is why I am as I am. That is why I believe as I believe. It's simply as that. Alright, so what more? Well, I can say for my future I am currently unemployed. Yay. Um, I will not. Um, I will not underscore. What do you call it? I will say that I am very interested in taking it, in going further with my education and getting a PhD. As it is of now, I don't see that happening. Now, I will not argue that I am just a perfect genius, and of course I should be allowed to get that PhD. As far as studying and exam-wise and sort of in that direction, I'm probably overall an average, okay, physicist with average grades and so on. So it's not like I would sort of define myself as the undiscovered genius that's just being held back by unfortunate circumstances. But the thing is, and that's where I get a little political here, which I usually don't. Now, I will not go into the details about explaining the political flavors in Denmark, because I know that probably most Americans see every politician in Denmark as being a communist or a socialist or something like that. But let's just say from a European or Scandinavian point of view, particularly a Danish point of view, there's a huge difference between left and right here in Denmark. But you could argue that the most leftist person in the most leftish person or politician in the U.S., even Bernie Sanders, is actually is probably compared to what we called the Liberal Alliance here in Denmark, something like that. Yeah. But I think it's interesting new tones in the U.S. in USA, and I really don't know how many Americans that are interested in at least Danish, but also European politics. But I do know that quite a few Danes are actually quite interested in what goes on politically in the US. We have strong opinions about your new president. I can say that at least. I have also strong opinions about him, but I will not utter them here, not at this moment, because this is not what this is about, what I'm going to say. But the thing is that from my point of view, the government we have now here in Denmark and the political direction that it has taken here in Denmark goes for a very what do you call it, market-oriented politics, and seeing the government situation as sort of a corporate or a business that needs to be driven. So we had a former minister of research and higher education that had sort of a motto that said from research to bill, if you want. So the idea was that we should try to advance research where it gave money and piss on the rest of it. Actually, it felt like that. And you could say that I would say, if you get the idea now that I'm just pissed about not being able to take a PhD here in Denmark in the specific subject that I have, you're absolutely correct. I am. That's no doubt about that. But I would also argue that I'm trying to see this from a larger perspective, a higher point of view, if you will, and that is that we have gone in the world, I would say, but also here in the Western world, the US, maybe not the US actually, I'm not sure about that, But at least here in Scandinavia, in Europe, and particularly in Denmark, we have gone from sort of an idea that knowledge, we've gone from the idea that knowledge has value in itself, more to the idea that knowledge should be the means to get something, and in particular get more money, that is, raise our national income or something like that. And I think that's a flawed tendency, and I think that's a problematic tendency. I think if we advance the research that can make money, we as a people, we as a nation, we as humans will become poorer. It might be that we have more money in the bank, but we have less knowledge about being humans. One very interesting example we had here in Denmark was that some of the rightish, I think that, I'm sorry, but I just think it's funny talking about left and right too. I checked my statistics on YouTube, and I would say that most of the people that watch my channel is of course Americans. Nonetheless, because I'm talking about flat Earth, and I believe that there are many more flat earthers in the US than there is here in Denmark or Europe as a whole. Nevertheless, I just find it funny talking about Danish politics and left and right to Americans, where you probably see again all of us as very, very leftish. But nevertheless, some of the righteous, some of the politicians in the right of our parliament criticized some research that have been done in one small Danish island called Bornholm, where they have a little troll or little gnome that is called Krøllebølle, and they made I think it was a PhD program or PhD thesis about Krøllebølle. And they called that meaningless, and they called that waste of money. And you can argue that research about Krøllebølle in some sense is not very important. But I would like to state that you have to make that argument from a scientific point of view, because if you make that argument about in an economical point of view, then you lose the whole purpose about this kind of research. All the humanities, all of the fine arts, all the research in literature, in music, in arts, all of that, also psychology, language, all of those things, you lose the meaning of the research if you only view it from an economical point of view. And that, I think, is very much the problem here. I would also say that I think that that's kind of a problem with the American system, where I think many of you universities are privately funded. That means that private investors have to invest money in the university, and they have to see some kind of return from that investment. Now, I will not say that there are not rich Americans that could be tempted to invest in this kind of research because they think the knowledge is important. But I don't think it's healthy for society if private investors have to decide for themselves. And let's be honest, the private investors in the US, as they are in Denmark, are not the broad community in the entire country. It's sort of a select few, right? You can argue that the universities get funding when they enroll students that pay for themselves, or their parents pay for themselves, or something like that. I'm completely on that. I get that. But the general idea that private investors, a few people, one person, one private investor, has to see the value of some kind of knowledge in order to invest in it, in order for that research to be viable, I don't think that's healthy. I'm not going to say that the Danish system is much more better than the American, because evidently it is not. since we have politicians here that are having the exact same stupid ideas, that in order for research to be valuable, you have to be able to count it in money. It has to return at some point in a product that you can sell, that can add to the capital, the money in the society, the wealth of the society. Yeah. And I don't think that's a good idea, honestly. So back to the whole point. The problem, there's several problems. Let's just be honest. The first thing is that I have now established myself as a father, as a husband, and has children that I have to take care of. If I were just me, and probably also my wife, who was at that point when I started studying was my girlfriend, if it had been just us, I would actually think that we could get to a point of in a place in time where we can say that it would be more agreeable for me to try to enlist myself in a PhD program offshore. And to be honest, I would like to do that. I would like to go to any European country to take my PhD if it was possible, even the US if that was possible, because I know that might be harder to get enrolled as a PhD student from a foreign country. But nevertheless, I would like to do that. But I have a family now to consider, so I can't just do that. And I also think that it is unfortunate that research programs, PhD positions, and general research, here in Denmark we call it research in ideas more than products or something like that. But that kind of research is being reduced, because it might be that that kind of research doesn't deliver many money or doesn't give us a lot of wealth, but it gives us knowledge about ourselves. Even research in religions, in Christianity, I find that very important, because it gives us insight into us as human beings. It gives us insight into who we are, where we are, what we are, and where we came from and where we are going. Even you can say that as for my field of study, that is astronomy and astrophysics and physics as a whole, we are dealing with trying to describe how the world is from the smallest part that you can imagine to the largest thing that you can imagine, the universe itself, but also the largest structures, superclusters, clusters of galaxies, stars, all that. We are dealing with all those things, and we are trying to, especially in cosmology, we're trying to investigate where we came from. What is our role in the universe, if we have a role at all? I don't think we have, but that's the idea, and I think that's unfortunate if that is being reduced. Now, you can argue also, before I conclude this here discussion, you can argue both for and against private investments. One thing is that private investments are independent of the political direction in a country. So if we had a private investor to fund the Dark Cosmology Center here in Copenhagen with enough money that we could enroll 10, maybe 15 PhD students, those positions and that funding would not be dependent on where the political direction would take in the country. Public funding of that kind of money, of that kind of research, is highly dependent on where the political direction is in the country. Now, I would say this much, that whereas we have had governments in Denmark, both with socialist or leftish and rightish politicians and ministers, The overall consensus in the parliament has actually been quite stable, I would argue that. So, but in the general idea, I think that we should return to that very important notion that knowledge has a value in itself. Even though if you have knowledge that you can produce absolutely nothing with, you cannot produce anything with it, you're not making money from it, you can probably even get a job, even not get a job by knowing it. It has value nonetheless, and I think that's very important to keep that in mind. In the preschool world, no, not preschool, in the elementary school world here in Denmark for some while ago, we had sort of a motto that say, if you want to translate it, we study for life, not school. And that motto was actually formulated in Latin, but I can't remember the Latin words. But the idea was at that point that when we teach someone in the elementary school in Denmark, we teach them because we want to make them whole persons. We want to make them, give them some ideas, some fundamental ideas, some ballast that they can use to live their lives. Not just so they can get some further education and become formally more knowledgeable and go in that way. And that was sort of the consensus at that point, that the formal education in the school was that you should be taught something like, for example, math, Danish, English, perhaps even Latin and German, and all of sort of the more philosophical concepts were sort of pushed aside and under prioritized. But the school world, the world in Denmark, the schools in Denmark and the teachers rebelled against that idea, and now it has been formally accepted. It was actually, it's beginning to go much the other way from a different argument, but it was then generally accepted that the school should prepare yourself for life, not just a life of study, but life itself. And that was put into the law of the school. Sorry. And is now widely generally accepted by teachers, by school leaders, and all those things. Today you might say that we should have the same notion, just turn it around a bit. We should say we study for life, not just the work life or work. Given that the political consensus or some political ideas in Denmark want you to study so you can get a job and make a lot of money. That should be the idea. So again, instead of having the idea that you should go to school and study because you can get an academic career and be an academic and go that way, now you should get an education because then you can get a good job and make a lot of money, so you can pay taxes, and then you can sort of rise the general wealth in the country. And of course, there's no doubt about that paying your taxes and expanding or increasing the general wealth in a society, in the Danish society, of course it's a good idea, but that's just not just the point with the education. That's a very nice spin-off that you can get. That's a nice consequence perhaps of getting that getting some kind of education, is that you have the abilities to go out and get a good job and make a lot of money perhaps. But the problem with that notion is that again we're down prioritizing all the educations we think that will not result in a job pretty easily, and we are up prioritizing the jobs, the educations that might give a higher a job just right after graduation. I think there's two problems with that thing, and that will be my last argument in this part before we go on to the second part. The first argument is sorry, my phone just chose to take a tumble down my tripod, so I had to pause it and get back. But I will. Let's pick up where we left. I talked about two arguments that were problematic in the sense that you should prioritize educations where the jobs are, and also that the young people should choose educations from where the jobs are, and also where you can get the jobs with the highest wages. The first problem is that we simply can't predict in any reasonable sense where the market is going with regards to what jobs are needed and what are not. There are some examples here in Denmark. At some point, our government told everybody, I think it was back in the 90s, maybe 80s, that young persons should seek in the engineering educations because we had a lot of need for engineers. And so they did. The engineering schools in Denmark, DTU and and Aarhus and so on. I think there's one in Aarhus, maybe it's Aalborg, I cannot remember. They got a lot of students, which resulted in a lot of engineers that couldn't find a job because at that point there was no need for engineers. And also at a later point they told all the young people, you should seek in to study as being elementary school teachers because we have a huge need for elementary school teachers. And so the young people did, and when they were finished there were no need for elementary school teachers, not in that amount at least. So trying to tell young people where they should seek education based solely on what the job situation, what the employment situation in a country is at a given moment, I think that's flawed. The second argument is that by that notion you are saying that the value of knowledge again is dependent on what kind of wages you can get from it, what kind of how it can increase the population and the country's wealth and so on. And I think that's flawed. I think that we need to go back to a situation. We need to go back to a philosophy where we say, well, of course it is important that we have people in a country that have ideas that can be sold and increase the wealth. Of course it is. But it is also very important that we give sort of a wide berth to all educations and all research. I would call it fundamental research that doesn't at a given point result in something that can be sold. And I think there's reasonable examples in the world that fundamental research, in Denmark we call it basic research, you could also call it that. We call it grundforskning. It's sort of the basic research, like for example physics. I think there's a reasonable amount of examples that basic or fundamental research has actually, in the long run, delivered spin-off products that could be sold and could increase the wealth, even though the research field itself didn't produce anything that could increase the wealth. And also, on a larger notion, that we have to say to ourselves that knowledge, no matter how insignificant it might seem to be, has a value in itself. That was it. Now I have relieved my politically burdened heart, and now I will go on to talk a little bit about some things that I have might said wrong. It's about orbital mechanics. I am a physicist, I'm not an engineer, and I'm particularly not an expert in orbital mechanics, but I've looked a little more into it. I've talked with some people, I've read some things, and I think now I have sort of a more deeper explanation on how we can send rockets into space and all those things. I will still argue, though, completely, that the idea that when you spew something out in space, for example, the RCS system, the reaction control system, the little nozzles that and then you can move a ship or a person around in space, that goes completely. That is physically acceptable because we have something called conservation of momentum. And conservation of momentum says very neatly that if you have two masses and they react in one way, for example, if you had a gun in space and you fired it, then you have a bullet inside the gun with a mass, and you have a person with a pistol that also have a mass, and if that bullet gets of some reaction, if that bullet gets a velocity in one direction, all the rest will get an equal and opposite reaction in that direction, but of course proportional to the mass. Now, since the mass of the bullet is many times smaller than the mass of the gun and the person, the bullet will fly out, but the person will probably just move quietly in one direction. But that goes whether you are spewing out artillery shells, machine gun fire, a pistol, a bullet, or you are spewing out collections of molecules itself. Now, I would argue, I have not tested it, I have not done the calculations in sort of in detail, but I would think that unless you make an assumption and see this clump of molecules being spewed out in the RCS system, unless you see that as sort of a collect of gas particles, sort of a blob of gas particles, it will be very hard to calculate how much the momentum you receive is. But nevertheless, you will probably have to integrate the whole thing. But just the idea that it cannot be done, and I know that some of you think that when you I can use a fun example. If you, for example, open the nozzle for a fire hose, and then the water comes spewing out, you receive a reaction from the hose. I have noticed that some of you think that that is because the water is pressing against something, but that is not the case. The reason why you are getting a reaction in the nozzle or in the hose is because of conservation of momentum. So let's just quickly look over that, over the board, up in the whiteboard. I'm not going to do any calculations, I'm just going to show the formula itself and how conservation of momentum applies. See you then. Alright, so welcome back. Now I'm standing up and have my trusted marker in my hand, and let's proceed on what I was talking about. So the first thing I would like to address shortly is conservation of momentum. So what is that? Let's take the example that I had before. So we have a gun here, and forgive me for not being very good at drawing. Firing a bullet here, a very large bullet you would see. So what can we say about the physical properties here? Let's first write the equation for momentum. So we have P is equal to mass times velocity. Now that is not a vectorial dot, just like that. That's the basic concept of momentum. Momentum is mass times velocity. So what can we say about the gun? Well, the gun has a mass. Let's call it in gun. Let's say that is 700 grams. Sure. The velocity of the gun, well, at this point, it's 0. The bullet, well, the mass of the bullet, 2 grams perhaps, 5 grams, I'm not sure. Doesn't really matter. And the velocity of the bullet, well, let's say it's 250 meters per second. So let's put some, you know that you have the mass, the bullet, you have the velocity of the bullet, and then you have the same, a mass of a gun, and the velocity of the gun. And that reaction will be in that direction. You can also view this idea, the concepts, from Newton's third law, I think it is, action equals reaction. So if the bullet, let's see the gun and the bullet as one system. If the gun ejects a bullet in one direction, or influence a bullet in one direction, the bullet will influence the gun equally and opposite of that reaction. That's also the idea about the conservation of momentum. So let's say in this particular case here, we would have that, sorry, not beta, P gun is equal to P bullet. So the momentum of the gun must be equal to the momentum of the bullet. That means if you expand that calculation over here, that M gun times V gun must be equal to M bullet times V bullet. So what is it that we don't know here? Well, we don't know the velocity of the gun after the bullet has been fired. So we rearrange this and we get M bullet, M bullet times V bullet divided by M gun is equal to V gun. Now this is just a particularly simple example. Whatever you use that with, the concepts are the same. You can make this calculation. And of course you will get that the velocity of the gun is no longer 0. So yeah, you can calculate this if you will. You can also look in one of the first videos I did about conservation of momentum. It doesn't matter, the idea is the same. And the calculations are the same. Let's go on. So one of the things I know, and that is again, you could say it's sort of a continuation of that idea here, is that let's just make a simple representation of a rocket engine. So I would say that we have some type of ignition chamber here. Then you need to compress the ignition. And what you might not expect is that it would look like this again. So you can imagine that what you actually see in a rocket from below is only this portion down here. So let's take it stepwise. What would happen, sort of a reaction chamber. First of all, we would put in some gas here. And again, some of you are trying to sort of argue that if you put a gas in here, it will spew out from the nozzle when we are in space, long before we could ignite it. So in order to address that concept, that question, we need to know what happens when a rocket engine is in space and when it is on the Earth. So let's just take the concept again. We're going to erase it and come back to it later. So first of all, why do we even have pressure here on Earth? Let's just make the surface of the Earth like this. Here am I. I'm probably happy. And let's just take a conceptual column of air here. So this column of air does not exist in reality. It's just to try to decrease or sort of constrain the explanation we need to do. So what happens here? Well, let's say that in this column of air we would put in, I would need to hold my breath for some time. We would evacuate this column of air here completely, and we have gravity pulling down. So what would happen for that particle we put in here? Well, since it has a mass, and Fg is equal to m times g, where g is let's just say that is 9.8 meters per second squared, it will fall down. And let's just say for some insurmountable amount of luck that it happens to land right on top of my head. So now that particle will influence the top of my head with a force equal to Fg. Let's put in some more particles right here. And they will also fall down, and then I would have a little stack of particles on top of my head, pushing me down. But of course, since they are not weighing that much, they don't have that high of a mass, I wouldn't feel it that much. Let's say that we fill in this entire column up here with particles, comparable to the amounts we have in the atmosphere on Earth. Then all of those particles here in this entire column would push on me from all sides. And that force that they are pushing me with, on anything with, is exactly the pressure that we have the surface of the Earth. Sorry, they're not pushing that much up. And that is also why when we go up in the atmosphere, let's just say for some reason I could float around up here somewhere. I'll probably not be happy here. It is only this part of the column of air that is pushing on me. This part here is just pushing downwards. So let's try to take another column of air and look at it without me. This is the column of air. And we still have a force of gravity, Fg. What would happen now? Well, because the particles are all being pulled down, the density up here, sorry, we can also use, let's call it row top. Here we have row middle and row surface. Because the force of gravity is pulling all those particles down, we can say that row of surface is much larger. It's larger than row mid, which is larger than row top. We can also say that row surface is much larger than row top. So this is the basic concepts of why we have a pressure here on Earth. This is pressure. All right. Let's look at a rocket engine again. So let's just take a look at the Earth. Sorry, need another color. Green Earth, yeah. No. Let's just make it flat too. Yeah, because it's easy. So the idea of describing the atmosphere like this. So here we have vacuum of space. And here we have atmosphere. And this is sort of the boundary. It is not correct. How could we actually describe it correctly? Well, it's like this. We have the surface of the Earth. And then we have a gradually decreasing, let's call this minus rho. We have a gradually decreasing density or pressure from down here to up here. And at some point, you would just be in a position where the pressure is so small that we would call it the vacuum of space. The density of the particles would be so small that they wouldn't exert any pressure on you, and that is why we would call it vacuum of space. So, and I can think, again, I think that I know where the idea comes from, is that you think of vacuum in relation to a vacuum cleaner. But actually I would say that a vacuum cleaner is a terrible concept, because it's completely wrong. It has nothing to do with vacuum. You could call it an under pressure cleaner, because that is what is going on. You're creating an under pressure inside the nozzle, or the nozzle, and the entire hose of the cleaner, which is pulling things inside. Because when you make under pressure inside that tube, then the outside air want to fill out that under pressure to equalize it. So again, I think I've commented on another video that I have put out, that I commented. Let's just take that example. Let's say that we have here a soda, an enclosed soda with a straw. So what happens when you suck on that straw? Well, first of all, you don't create vacuum anywhere. But again, imagine that all the air around this cup of soda is pressing downwards on the surface. So when you suck on that straw here, let's say air out, you are creating under pressure. Under pressure inside the straw. And again, like with the cleaner, the outside air immediately wants to equalize that under pressure. But since there's a lot of water keeping the air from going inside the straw, the air would instead press onto the water or the soda, which will go up through the straw and into your mouth, and you can drink it. That is how a straw in a soda or any kind of beverage you would like to drink, that is how it works. It has nothing to do with vacuum. Let's get to the point. Let's take a look at what this was actually about. So when we have a rocket engine, I'll just make it like this. On Earth, this is completely open, so let's just say out here we have, I think it's 1000 kilopascal. I can't remember if that's a Pascal. I think it's like this. But inside all of this chamber, you also have 1000 kilopascal. They're equalized. What happens when we are in outer space with the rocket engine? Well, let's just say we have 0 kilopascals in here, but we have also 0 kilopascals inside the rocket engine. Let's just keep that in mind. So the pressure is equalized in both situations, both when the rocket is inside our atmosphere and when it is outside our atmosphere. So let's take a typical example from a Hollywood movie. So we have a chamber here with a pressurized door. In here we have roughly 1000 kilopascals again. Out here we have 0 kilopascals, vacuum of space. So what happens when we open that door here? Well, from the point of view inside the chamber, it would seem that the vacuum is sucking all of the air out. But that is actually not the point. That is not the case. Just like with the vacuum cleaner, the under pressure cleaner, in Denmark we actually call it a dust sucker. Not a sucker like a fool, but a sucker like a suck. And also the case with the straw, the air wants to equalize. So what happens when we open the door? The air inside here, which has a much higher pressure than the air outside here, will force its way out through the door, out here, and imagine that you are taking all of this air, and let's just say that it's a pretty big room. Let's say it's 100 meters times 50 meters. It's a pretty big room, right? It's 5,000. I think it is 5,000 cubic meters of air that wants to escape through that little hole. So of course it's like when you're trying to blow a lot of air through a straw, it will go really fast out that tiny hole. And it would seem that this air or the vacuum out here is sucking all of those things through the hole, but actually it is the air inside the room that is pushing all of the things through that little hole, because, let's put a man in here. He's not happy, clearly not happy. Put his arm over here, something like that. He just tied his neck to that lever here, really bad idea. But the point is that the reason why he's in danger of flying out through that hole is because all of that air inside that room wants to escape out, and he's just unfortunate enough that the air wants to pull him with him. It's like when you're standing in a gale force wind, you can feel the wind is pushing against you, almost knocking you on your head. That's not because something behind you is trying to suck you to it, but it's because the wind, the air moving towards you, is pushing you in that direction, and that is exactly what is happening in such a situation here. The air inside the room is pushing against him, trying to escape out that little hole. So let's take the rocket engine again. So let's take an engine on Earth and see what happens. At least how I think it's happened. I would like to say, if any of my viewers, and I know that Red's Rhetoric has a friend who's actually working at NASA, and I think he's designing rockets. I'm not sure if he's designing them or working on them, but nevertheless, he's engaged with rocket design and functionality at NASA. If you or any other that knows something about this stuff wants to point out where I'm wrong, please don't hesitate, because I'm not an expert in this field. I'm just trying to use my common physical knowledge, the knowledge that I have, to try to imagine what I think would happen inside a rocket. All right, so what happens? Let's design a rocket engine like this on Earth. All right, so the first thing is that what we want to do again, because we want to use this connection here, momentum is equal to mass times velocity, and because P1 is equal to P2, conservation of momentum. The first thing is that we want to try to explode something inside this chamber, a fuel. So we put in a little blob of fuel inside the middle, ignite it, and then it explodes in all directions. Simply in all directions, but because, let's make it like this. But because there's only one escape for that gas, that expanding gas, and that's downwards. Most, if not all, of the movement will be in this direction. The overall movement will be downwards. Now, let me just take a minute to explain why the nozzles look like this. So the idea is that you ignite a certain amount of fuel in here, it expands and it moves downwards through this nozzle. Now you can imagine if you have a water hose, if you sort of squeeze it tight on the end, the water will come out spewing much faster. And that's what's going on here. You're trying to take that whole explosion and force it through a tiny hole, not tiny, but smaller hole, to increase its velocity. Now what happens, and I can't remember what the technical terms are, but one interesting thing is that when you design this nozzle here, this part here, so that when the gas reaches this point down here, its speed is supersonic. At that particular point here. But what happens if we were to do it like this, let's just make the same design, but like this. And again, at some point here, the gas will reach supersonic speed. From that point on down here, let's call this V1, V1, and this V2, then V2 would actually be less than V1. And that is because when a gas is compressed and reaches a supersonic speed or velocity and is further compressed, it will lose that velocity. It will go subsonic again. So what engineers has found is that if you have this gas going down here and it reaches the supersonic speed at that point, by then inverting the nozzle like this, the velocity will further increase to be further supersonic. And then finally being spewed out in this direction here. Let's call that, all of this blob in here, we call it M gas. And down here, it has V gas. Of course, all of this is connected to our rocket. So we have M rocket and we have V rocket. Now at this point, M rocket, let's just say it's M rocket, and we know that V rocket is 0. So again, we use the concepts as before, and we can again say that if we have M gas times V gas, that is equal to M rocket times V rocket. And again, the unknown in this case is V rocket. So we get that M gas times V gas over M rocket is equal to V rocket. And again, the conservation of momentum applies. So let's take the final case. Let's take the case where you would actually be correct. Let's say that we had this rocket design here enclosed. So we would shut it off at this point down here, or let's just say here. We would cut it off. So when the rocket is out in space, we would have roughly 1,000 kilopascals in here, and we would have 0 kilopascals in here. Then we would fill up this room with fuel. We would open this nozzle here, and because all of that air inside here with the fuel, where the pressure is actually increased a little bit because we put in some more particles, would be the entire room would be evacuated out through the nozzle, because that air and that gas inside there would want to equalize with the outside. Now, the reason why the pressure will increase when we are putting in this little amount of fuel is because the system is closed off from the outside environment. And you can imagine if you close something off, like a balloon, if you take a balloon and you put air inside it, it will expand because you increase the pressure. And the reason why the balloon gets bigger is because it wants to equalize with the outside environment. All right, so what happens actually in space? Well, since the system is not closed off, when the rocket sits in space, the pressure inside here is 0 kilopascal. Remember, as the rocket traverses up through our atmosphere, the pressure gradually decreases. It decreased outside the rocket, but it also decreased inside this little system here, this rocket system here. And you have a little nozzle here, perhaps some kind of nozzle, that spew in the fuel, and then you have some ignition system. And that means that the fuel will just expand out through this room here. Now, of course, if you kept putting fuel inside the room without igniting it, eventually it will sieve out through the portion here. But if you keep igniting it, it will stay put, ignite, and then push itself out through the rocket. And since again, conservation of momentum works also in outer space. Let's give another example, an inverse example. So let's just say that that's an example enough. For example, in a car engine, is the piston. Then you have the nozzle here. Then you have some of the valves here. So when, as far as I remember it, the circle of a car system is that first the piston goes down, then you put in, and air is sucked inside. Then the valve is closed off and fuel is spewed in. I think it's something like this. It might be that this is at the same time, but nevertheless, you have the piston goes up, compressing the air inside, which is then ignited. Boom, piston goes down. You have a lot of, then you open up another set of valves, and the room and all of that smog and all of that residual waste is evacuated from the chamber. This is not exactly correct, but it's just to illustrate that even in an enclosed system like this, where there is some pressure inside this chamber here, you can spray in fuel from a nozzle without having to consider anything. So it's possible that you can spray in fuel from a nozzle in a vacuum, and then it will stay so roughly put. All right. So the final thing I will go into is the idea of what happens when, why does a rocket try to, some of the discussions that has been both here in Denmark and I think also on several YouTube channels is, why don't a rocket just go straight out in space? For example, if you can see the moon here, send a rocket up to the moon. Why not do that? Several reasons. The first thing is that this is the surface of the Earth, and here's our rocket. Let's say that this is the state-of-the-art SpaceX rocket with really, really expensive, powerful engines. And we were to just shoot that rocket out in space, straight out. And this is sort of the barrier of our atmosphere. The rocket would go like this, and eventually at some point it will lose its fuel, and it will fall back. And that won't work. So what do we do? Well, let's use gravity instead of fighting it. So what we do when we have, this is the Earth here, we send out a rocket like this. But since we don't want the rocket to, so that is why when the rocket takes off, it sort of banks and goes sideways through the atmosphere. Actually above most of the dense part of the atmosphere. But if we didn't do anything else, it will fall back to the Earth. So what happens at some point here, and now again you must correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is called periapsis. We would ignite the engines in order to increase, this is the apoapsis, I think it's APO, to increase this part here, so the orbit the rocket will actually go around like this. Now there is a famous drawing, I think it's Newton's actually, that describes why we want to do this. So let's imagine we have Earth here, we have a really large tower here with a very, very powerful cannon. So we put in a little amount of powder, ignite it, and the bullet will go like this. So we put in a little more powder, and the bullet will go like this. A little more powder, a little more powder. Sorry, that was not correct. Like this. And then we put in just the right amount of powder. So the bullet goes like this. That is essentially how an orbit works, and that is why when physicists talk about about orbits, it's actually that something, some rocket or some satellite, or whatever it is falling towards the Earth, but has enough tangential velocity to keep falling beside the Earth. This is what this illustrates. So let's take a look. Now we have our orbit in we have our rocket in orbit around the Earth here. The orbit is here. And again we say, well, let's put periapsis here. I think it's PEO, I'm not sure. And put apoapsis here. I might have these two reversed. Now remember that it takes 3 days for some object with that velocity to go out, roughly 3 days to go out to the moon. But in any case, given a certain amount of velocity, you can calculate how long it will take. But let's just, for the sake of argument, say that we know that when the rocket is out here, the moon will be here. So what do we do? Well, what we do is that this is the expected position of the moon, and at the right amount of time in the past, this is the predicted position, and then at the right moment we engage our engines of the rocket down here, keep burning them for a certain amount of time, which means that we will increase the apoapsis. So it will be more elliptical, like this, like this, like this, until it finally perhaps look like this. Now of course we would have to make some adjustments along the route, but you can imagine that when the rocket goes somewhere around here, the gravitational influence from Earth will actually be much less than the influence from the moon. But then again, when we go out to the moon and we reach a certain point here, we would have to again adjust our angle of the rocket and burn our engines in order to be captured and go in an orbit around the moon. So that's how you do it. Alright, so what then when we go, that was the first part. This is how you would go to the moon using orbital mechanics. You simply increase the ellipticity of your orbit around the Earth. This is pretty circular, but if you burn the engines at one point, you will increase the ellipticity and the radius of that orbit in the other direction. And of course then you can calculate how long it will take for the moon to reach this position given this certain amount of burning. But from point of view of what you probably all have been shown, because we don't want to show this circular orbit, it's actually pretty meaningless for what is happening, is that I think for the Apollo program the ejection curve was something like this. But if the moon was not there, the orbit would have looked something like this. And go back to Earth again. Alright, so this is how we get to the moon. What then when we have to go back? I told you in one of my videos that the shuttle could just position itself at some point over a runway and then just push its way through the atmosphere. That's not correct. I'm not sure it's incorrect, but that's certainly not the way it's done. So what is done? Again, this is about calculations. So again, remember, here we have Earth. Let's see if I can draw a nice shuttle. Yeah, that's okay. That's a shuttle. And let's say that the Cape Canaveral or Kennedy Space Flight Center, whatever it's called, is at that point here. And we have our orbit like this. So one thing is that if the orbit is going around like this direction here is called prograde, and this direction here is called retrograde. So for example, the moment we wanted to expand our orbit to go out to the moon, we used a prograde burn in order to expand the opposite side of the orbit. And now we want to land, we use a retrograde burn, because what will then happen if we make a retrograde burn here, the orbit will go something like this instead. And of course you can decrease it even further, so it actually goes inside the Earth and out again. But nevertheless, what a space shuttle will do when they know that where they want to be is on the opposite side of where they are at the point. So I think I was a little imprecise here, so I would like to correct the statement a little bit. So again, here we have the Earth here. Let's just put in a country like this. Just so we are on the same page whether what this is meant to represent. And as you can see, I put in the shuttle again, this time facing the correct way, preparing to make this retrograde burn. So what I said was that the shuttle would be here and do the retrograde burn, and then Cape Canaveral would be here. But it takes some time for the shuttle to get from here to over here. And because even though the shuttle is moving much faster than the Earth is rotating, the Earth is rotating. So what I actually meant was that at the time of the burn, the retrograde burn, to slowly orbit down over here, and I think that I found that the apoapsis is the point in the orbit where the velocity, the tangential velocity, is slowest. So that would be the highest point. So this is, I think it's APA or APO, I can remember it. And likewise over here we have PEA, which is the periapsis. This is the point where the speed in the orbit is the fastest, that is the lowest lowest point. Alright, so what we have is, in order for the shuttle to land safely on, for example, the runway at Cape Canaveral, the shuttle will position itself in a retrograde orientation and then make a burn which will slow it down and lessen the height of the orbit over here. But at the time of the burn, Cape Canaveral is up here somewhere. I remind you that that was also one of the things that I missed on the previous explanation. The Earth is rotating in this direction here, like this, and the shuttle is orbiting around the Earth like this, so that so that the shuttle won't enter into the atmosphere going against it, but going with it. That's a good thing. All right. Even though the atmosphere will slow it down, of course. So you need to do the calculations, and that can be done, so that when you start the burn here, you will know how much velocity you will gain, and hence how much time it will take you to get at this point here. And when you do the burn, you need to calculate it and time it so that Cape Canaveral, which is up here somewhere, will be roughly at the same position as when you do the burn. Now, of course, you can increase, like I said, you can increase the velocity. You can increase the burn time and then further increase the ellipticity of your orbit. That means that instead of entering the atmosphere here, you could do it here or here. But it all depends of some calculations that is perfectly in order and perfectly doable. That was it. They will make a retrograde burn until that orbit is until the orbit goes through the atmosphere. Now, of course, you have to and the reason why you could do it like this is that you would have to go the furthest amount to have the slightest angle of attack on the atmosphere. Now, of course, you all know that you would have to make the angle of attack small enough so that you don't burn up in the atmosphere, but again also large enough so that you don't skip out of the atmosphere. So it might be that when you start the retrograde burn, the Kennedy space, the Cape Canaveral will be here, or it might be here. I'm not sure about that, but the important thing is here that you can calculate where you want to be when you re-entry, and then you can get that re-entry by using a retrograde burn when you're in orbit. So I think that's sort of the conclusion of some of the minor mistakes that I've made in some of my other videos. And again, comment as much as you want, but please keep the Bible thumping from yourself. I don't want to hear it. If you have a solid, valid argument that you can state using some notion of the Bible, it's okay. But keep reminding me that I had to repent and accept Jesus in my heart and yada 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 yada. You are not impressing me. You're actually boring me. So please stop it. But other than that, thank you for listening. And I hope that you will, I hope now that I have some time to make some new videos, and I hope that you will enjoy watching, I hope that you will enjoy watching my videos as much as I actually enjoy making them.